What's up, everybody? This is your boy YuYu Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And I'm here. This is what y'all wanted, so I'm here now. I'm here to completely annihilate Team Hakusho. And for the last couple of days, everybody, YuYu Hikari, where's your video, man? We need a new video, man. It's the great debate, man. What's going on? So now I'm here to completely annihilate Team Hakusho. So this is what you want me to do. You want me to put up a 28-year-old man who, when he was 14 years old, was an assassin during the Bakumatsu against a 14-year-old kid whose claim to fame was skipping school and wearing a green jumpsuit. Is that what you want me to do? Say no more. The champ is here, baby. Say no more. The savior of Team Kenshin is here. Say no more. But before I get into this video, two things. First, subscribe to the Cloud Village. That's number one. Keep supporting this movement. Keep supporting the versus matches that we put out. And we really do appreciate all the, encouragement and support that we've been getting. Second of all, the reason why this video is a couple of days late is because I had a prior commitment that I could not get out of. And it basically kept me busy all day yesterday from about 8 o'clock in the morning until about 11 o'clock at night. And there was just no way that I could get out of it. And it was really important that I be there for this person who had, asked for my help. So that's basically the reason why this video is a little bit late, but I'm here now. So I sort of stole J-Man's formula just a little bit. So there's going to be four categories that this sort of versus match is going to be broken into. The first is world building, which is worth 2 points. The second is story, which is worth 3 points. The third is the main character, which is also worth 3 points. And the fourth and final category is secondary characters, which is worth 2 points. Now, I know some of you may be saying, YuYu Hikari, that's 10 points, man. What if it's a tie? It's not going to be a tie. There's no tie here. It's not going to be a tie. So you don't even have to worry about that, Team Hakusho. You don't even have to worry about that. So first, let me get into world building. For those of you who may not know, world building is the process of constructing an imaginary world. The process of constructing a fictional setting within which the story takes place. And it encompasses, various aspects such as the mythology of that world, the created cultures and civilizations of that world, the sort of historical development of various aspects of that world, the geographical layout, as well as the sort of various realms that constitute, the overarching universe of that world. So in YuYu Hakusho, for example, you may have the human world, the spirit world, and the demon world, which are the various realms that make up the universe of that world. So let me first talk about, the world building in YuYu Hakusho. Honestly, I would say it's good, but it's not great. I would say that the world building itself, if you just look at the world building, it's kind of, just average. The spirit world is kind of, meh. We don't get much of the spirit world. We know that Koenma and Koenma's father are the sort of governing authority figures of that world, but we don't really delve too much into, what that world looks like or how it's constituted. Although we do get a brief sense of that, I believe, in the Spirit Detective saga, when Yusuke and the gang have to fight the 4 Saint Beasts. And the human world is sort of, the same. It's just, the human world, the basic, your everyday, ordinary human world. There's nothing really special about it. But what Togashi Yoshihiro does very well is that he has a way of integrating his world building into his plot and his story and the sort of concepts and themes that make up the story. And that's a very that's a technique that you don't see that often, especially with respect to how the characters relate to the various world building aspects of the sort of universe that he creates. And so there are two examples of how he does this. The first is the relationship that Toguro has to the demon world, and the second is the relationship that Sensui has to the demon world. So if you remember, Toguro sort of transformed himself into a monster because of his inability to, well, I'll get into this a little bit later on, but basically, his pupils were killed by a sort of demon, and that basically left him, psychologically numb. He couldn't cope with the situation, and I believe as a result, he sort of transformed himself into a demon so that he didn't have to deal with those sort of human emotions. And so that's sort of the reason why Toguro wants to go to the demon world in order to sort of get out of the human world to sort of go and gain his power absolute, to test his limitations, and to sort of, basically run away from his emotional problems that are connected to the human world. And this sort of similar thing happens to Sensui in his relationship to the demon world. He tries to go to the demon world, to sort of atone for his actions as a spirit detective, when he used to be a spirit detective, and the way that he sort of, was very, merciless in how he used to kill off demons, and the way he saw demons, and the way he saw the dividing line between humans and demons as just, black and white. And so he wanted to go to the demon world for reasons of, atonement and justice, because he wanted to recognize the sort of full complexity of demon kind. Basically, he didn't want to treat, demons as animals anymore. He wanted to treat them as if they were, persons deserving of, dignity. Now, when we get to the world building in Kenshin, Kenshin is sort of at a disadvantage here, partially because Rurouni Kenshin is a historical manga, and Watsuki Nobuhiro doesn't need to construct a world. The world in which the manga takes place, the world in which the story takes place, is basically already exists. But he does have, a little bit of world building in terms of the sort of historical development of that world. Obviously it's not, straight up history, and so he has to construct a sort of, fake history, if you will, of the Bakumatsu. But he also has to be attentive to the fact that he has to create sort of situations and stories and characters who are sort of ideologically consistent with that historical period. And there's also some things in there, like there are also some Buddhist mythology in there. I believe there's also some Christian mythology in there, and this sort of comes out especially with Monk Anji. But for the most part, I would say that Watsuki Nobuhiro doesn't really go through any, um, intensive, aspects of world building as it relates to, the Rurouni Kenshin manga. And so for me, this is just the easy 2 points for Togashi. Like I said, Togashi sort of revolutionizes how world building functions. The world itself is integral to the story, and again, you see that with both Toguro and Sensui. And the world building also functions as a device for character development and as a device for characterization, because the reasons why Toguro and the reasons why Sensui want to go to the demon world is very important for, the sort of, their psychological and ethical development. And he also uses the world building as a sort of, device for the exploration of various themes and concepts, like, Sensui's, commitment to atonement and justice, and sort of, Togoro's, the reason why he becomes psychologically numb. So again, this is the easy points for Team Togashi. But don't worry, it gets real. I mean, for Team Hakusho, but don't worry, it gets real bad for you guys for the next three categories. So here we go. The next category is, story, which is worth 3 points. So story to me encompasses two very important things. It encompasses the sort of complexity of the narrative form, which is the way that the mangaka blends various genres and subgenres together. And it also encompasses sort of, the narrative coherence of how those various genres fit together. And the second thing that the story encompasses is the content of the story. The obvious question being, what is the story about? Is this story original? Is it unique? What are the sort of concepts and themes that the mangaka is working with? When it comes to YuYu Hakusho, YuYu Hakusho is basically a story that chronicles the work of Yusuke Urameshi as a spirit detective. For the most part, it's a straightforward action story. Although it has various plot points that particularly align with the four sagas. But they're not the four sagas themselves. Since Yusuke works as a spirit detective and he works on a case-by-case basis, there is no overarching narrative that sort of organizes the Spirit Detective saga, the Dark Tournament saga, the Chapter Black saga, and the saga of the Four Kings. There's no real overarching narrative. The only real link between those various, cases or sagas is the development of Yusuke Urameshi. And so it's the story, basically the story of how Yusuke Urameshi evolves into a man, or, his coming of age story. And this gets to the sort of, narrative form of Yu Yu Hakusho. Basically, Yu Yu Hakusho is a Bildungsroman. It's, that comes from the German, and it's basically a coming of age story. The story of the development of a main character or protagonist from sort of adolescence into adulthood. And so it chronicles the sort of, moral and psychological development of the main character or the protagonist. And for the most part, I think this is somewhat cliche. Most stories in the shonen genre are about precisely this, chronicling the sort of, adventures of the protagonist and sort of, narrating their development from adolescence into adulthood. So to me, I think, I think Togashi, don't get me wrong, Togashi is a very good writer, and the way that he does this is excellent. But for the most part, it's straightforward action. It can be clearly situated within the shonen genre, and it's a Bildungsroman, which is very cliche for the shonen genre. Now, when we get to Rurouni Kenshin, this isn't true at all. What Watsuki Nobuhiro is attempting to do something that is way more complex than just your average generic, shonen series that, again, chronicles the development or the evolution of the protagonist from adolescence into adulthood. So, what is Rurouni Kenshin about? Very basic question, and you can tell sort of immediately that it's not going to be easy to answer that question. It's in the shonen genre, but it's also a romance, and it's also, a historical manga, and so there's various aspects of this sort of narrative. But basically, it's a sort of, it's a narration of Kenshin's journey of, spiritual, psychological, and sort of moral evolution. And it's different from a Bildungsroman because, obviously, if whenever you have a story, it's going to chronicle the sort of evolution of the main character. But the difference is that Kenshin is 28 years old, which is very, very unique for a shonen series. And if you sort of read, the notes that Watsuki Nobuhiro leaves behind in the manga chapters, he actually says that, the oldest I could make Kenshin was 28 years old, because it would be somewhat unrealistic to have him be an assassin during the Bakumatsu, as a 13-year-old. So the sort of oldest he could make Kenshin was 28 years old. And so obviously this isn't going to be, about chronicling how he evolves from an adolescent into an adult. It's, by the time the manga starts, which is also very unique, Kenshin is already a grown man, and on top of that, his work as an assassin, which sort of constitutes his backstory, is already over. Like, the main origin of Kenshin Himura's sort of, psychological turmoil has been over. And it hasn't just ended. It's been over for sort of 10 years. So he's been, wandering around for 10 years. So Rurouni Kenshin starts off as a samurai story. But the difference is, the difference from other samurai stories is that this is a very psychological manga, right? The emphasis isn't on, Kenshin Himura's adventures as a samurai. The emphasis is on his path to atonement and the sort of psychological process and the psychological evolution that he has to go through in order to find out what the answer is to how to atone for what he feels are his sins committed during the Bakumatsu as an assassin. In terms of narrative form, like I said, this manga is way more complex than YuYu Hakusho. And like Larry said in that video that I did with him on anime favorites, Rurouni Kenshin, Watsuki Nobuhiro brings a kind of sophistication to the shonen genre that did not exist before Rurouni Kenshin. And here's why. First, because Rurouni Kenshin is a romance. It is a romance story. And for those of you who don't know, the actual subtitle of Rurouni Kenshin is Meiji Swordsman Romantic Story. So that lets you know right off the bat that what we're dealing with here is a romance story, not an action story, although Rurouni Kenshin is an action story, but the primary subgenre or genre in which Rurouni Kenshin fits is the romance genre. So Watsuki Nobuhiro is very interested in sort of the romantic relationship between Kaoru and Kenshin Himura, and also he wants to link the sort of psychological evolution and growth that Kenshin goes through, and he wants to combine that with the romantic aspects of the story. So Rurouni Kenshin is sort of, about is about the sort of way that violence transforms Kenshin's psyche, or the way that violence has transformed his consciousness. And so the sort of thing that Kenshin Himura wants to get at through this process that he has to go through, this process of finding out how to atone, is that he has to figure out what makes us, the sort of thing that he figures out is what makes us human is the ability to sort of place violence within the context of ethics, but also the sort of way that Watsuki Nobuhiro goes about sort of placing violence within the context of ethics is by creating this sort of romantic relationship between Kamiya Kaoru and Kenshin Himura on the other hand. But in addition to that, Rurouni Kenshin is also, like I said, a historical manga, and particularly it's in the historical realism subgenre. It's based on the Bakumatsu, and in particular, it's based on the sort of, civil war. Basically, is what it was, the civil war between the Tokugawa shogunate, on the one hand, who wanted to keep this sort of imperial order in place, and the Ishin Shishi on the other hand, who were, the pro-nationalists and the pro-imperialists. And it chronicles the sort of transformation of Japanese society from the shogunate into the Meiji government. But Rurouni Kenshin also fits into the samurai subgenre of the shonen genre. Although, like I said before, the emphasis is less on, Kenshin Himura's exploits as a samurai, and is more and Nobuhiro is more interested in the sort of, outlining or sketching the sort of, psychology of the samurai. And it's obviously also the sort of, action shonen series. And so Watsuki Nobuhiro has placed Rurouni Kenshin into various genres: romance, historical, samurai, and shonen, and in, various subgenres. And so the narrative form that Rurouni Kenshin takes is, as far as I can tell, way more complex than the narrative form that Yu Yu Hakusho takes. So to me, this isn't even debatable. Easy 3 points for Watsuki Nobuhiro and Rurouni Kenshin. So Togashi, may have, revolutionized world building, but Watsuki absolutely revolutionized the sort of narrative forms that the shonen manga could take, and the way he integrates sort of multiple genres and multiple subgenres together. Absolutely genius. Absolutely genius. So as it stands now, Watsuki Nobuhiro versus Togashi Yoshihiro. 3 points to Team Kenshin, 2 points to Team Hakusho. Now let's get into the main characters of each series. And when I say, main characters, what I'm really talking about is the sort of internal characterization of both of Kenshin Himura on the one hand and of Yusuke Urameshi on the other hand. So this encompasses things like purpose, goals, desires, motivation, but it also includes their sort of psychological and ethical evolution and their psychological and ethical complexity. So for Yusuke Urameshi in the Spirit Detectives saga, he basically starts out as a street punk. His mother is an alcoholic. His father isn't around. Father doesn't exist, and he's been branded as a failure by the teachers at his school, by the other students at his school, and Yusuke's main problem is that he's grappling with what I think is internalized self-hatred. And the reason why I say that is because he sort of believes it when the people around him tell him that he's a failure. He engages in self-destructive behavior by skipping school, by constantly getting into fights, and so on one hand, he's grappling with the fact that he sort of internalized this self-hatred. He's dealing with the abandonment issues, but based on the fact that his father isn't there and his mother doesn't properly take care of him. But also, he has a, a fear of failure. It's because of the fact that he's internalized this self-hatred, and he sort of internalized these beliefs that he's a failure. That he has this fear of failure, which in the Dark Tournament saga, we can see really holds him back from reaching his full potential. Um, and in the Dark Tournament saga, we get to see, the full complexity of Yusuke's character. And Togashi Yoshihiro does this by using Toguro as a foil to Yusuke. A foil is, a literary technique whereby, an author, in this case, a mangaka, sort of uses one character as a way to either compares or contrast one character to another in order to highlight various aspects of both characters, characterization basically. Um, and by using Toguro as a foil, Togashi is able to sort of, explore the deeper complexity and the depth of the psychological problems that Yusuke has. And we, like I said before, we get to see precisely why it is that Yusuke can't use his powers. So let me just talk about Toguro for a second in order to highlight those important aspects of Yusuke Urameshi's character. So 50 years before the start of the series, we see various flashbacks of, Toguro with Genkai. And, we see that Toguro, used to be teamed up with Genkai. And in that flashback, and in one flashback in particular, I can't actually remember when this occurs in the manga, but there are some early hints at Togoro's sort of, psychological instability. And this particularly comes out when Toguro tells Genkai, I can't remember exactly what he said, but to paraphrase him, he said something like he didn't want to die and that he wanted to become not immoral, he wanted to become immortal and to gain, power absolute. And we see that part of the problem that Toguro is struggling with is the fact that he hasn't he seems to not want to come to grips with his own humanity. Part of what it means to be a human is to embrace your own mortality and to struggle through your own mortality. But from the very beginning, we see that that Toguro just does not want to come to grips with his own humanity. And later on, he starts a dojo, and a demon, kills all of his pupils. And in a very similar way to Yusuke Urameshi, Toguro sort of internalizes this self-hatred because he basically goes on a guilt trip. He has a major sense of guilt, based on the fact that he wasn't able to save his pupils, and based on the fact that he didn't have the power to save his pupils. And as a result, like I said, he internalizes self-hatred. He becomes psychologically numb. He starts experiencing all types of guilt, which is the real reason why he wants to go to limbo for 10,000 years. At least that's my take on why he opts to go to limbo for 10,000 years. And as a result, he sort of transforms himself into a demon. The interesting aspect of Toguro is this. Toguro is not a demon because he asks the committee to transform him into a demon, or he gets transformed into a demon by the committee after he wins the dark tournament. That's not the real reason why Toguro is a demon. The real reason why Toguro is a demon is because he's psychologically numb. He's allowed himself to internalize this self-hatred, for decade after decade after decade, to feel this, guilt for decade after decade after decade, and to not cope with the guilt and the internalized self-hatred that he feels. And so his humanity is compromised, not because he transforms his body into a demon, but his humanity is compromised because psychologically he transforms himself into a demon. And I know I've said this before, but let me just briefly say this again. This is the ideological foundation of the fight between Yusuke and Toguro. Like, Yusuke had to, by fighting Toguro, Yusuke had to learn not to let his self-hatred and his fear of failure transform him into a sort of psychological monster, the way Toguro allowed himself to be transformed into a sort of psychological monster. And this is what Genkai tried to teach Yusuke Urameshi. She had to teach him that it was okay to feel sadness, that it was okay to feel pain and grief. Because to eliminate those feelings and to not be able to cope with those feelings would only transform you into a sort of, psychological monster. And that the elimination of those things don't make you powerful, the way Toguro thought that, eliminating those feelings or not coping with those feelings would make him powerful. It only leads to more internalized self-hatred, more guilt, and it only disfigures your humanity even more. And so these are the things that, Genkai had to teach, Yusuke Urameshi. And this is the bulk of, the real characterization of Yusuke Urameshi happens, I think, in the sort of Spirit Detective saga and in the Dark Tournament saga. Obviously he gets more, character development as the series progresses, but I think that this is the core of his character development. This is the point at which he's no longer an adolescent, and he transforms into, taking up the responsibilities of being a man. And for this, I think Togashi is an absolute genius when it comes to characterization. And, even though, YuYu Hakusho was, ended in 1994, the manga has aged really, really well. It still stacks up to, any manga that's out today, or any manga that has been, released since. And it's like, Insane Game Freak said in one of his videos. He said, if it feels like YuYu Hakusho is somewhat cliche, that's only the case because it set the standard for, for the street punk who, is transformed from an adolescent into a responsible, man. So now let's, go to Kenshin Himura and the sort of, character development that Watsuki Nobuhiro does with him, which, even though Togashi did a, like I said, he's a genius, Watsuki Nobuhiro just stepped it up a little bit more when it comes to Kenshin Himura. So in the Tokyo arc, um, we already see that Kenshin, when the manga starts, is already a psychologically complex main character or protagonist. And the reason why I say this is because he has a split personality. It's Kenshin Himura versus Batosai the Manslayer, and he's constantly grappling with the dual aspects of, you know, his psychology. And Batosai the Manslayer sort of represents the part of his consciousness that was forged in the violence of the Bakumatsu. And this is sort of, you know, what Hiko Seijiro was trying to explain to Kenshin when he initially wanted to join the Ishin Shishi during the Bakumatsu. He explained to him that Kenjutsu is, you know, you may try and use it to create a new era of peace, but at its core, Kenjutsu is the art of killing. And once you start killing, it transforms you psychologically, and it sort of, you know, again, disfigures your humanity in a way. And so the Batosai aspect of Kenshin psychology is, tied, symbolizes or represents Kenshin's ties to the violence of the past. And it sort of indicates, the aspect of his psychology that doesn't want to take moral responsibility for his actions as, Batosai the Manslayer. And so every time he has to revert back into Batosai, it shows that he's, not willing to take the moral responsibility that's a necessary aspect of trying to atone for what he's done as Batosai the Manslayer. And this clearly comes out in a famous line. I think it's a famous line that Hajime Saito says to Kenshin Himura, when Kenshin Himura says to him, I believe that I don't have to, become Batosai the Manslayer in order to protect, my friends or the people around me. And Hajime Saito takes that Gatotsu stance, and he says to him, I deny your existence. So, the question that sort of drives Kenshin Himura throughout, at least the initial parts of, the manga in the Tokyo arc and in the Kyoto arc, is whether or not, Batosai is an integral component of his very existence. Whether or not he can, whether or not there's a possibility of existence for him that does not include Batosai the Manslayer, that does not include him being tied to, the history of violence that he's sort of gone through. In the Kyoto arc, Kenshin starts out on this, journey of psychological transformation to sort of, prove that his existence can be more than, having to rely on Batosai the Manslayer in order to have the power he needs to protect, his friends and to, get rid of Makoto Shishio. So if you haven't seen, my Rurouni Kenshin manga review, I'm just going to explain, the sort of, psychological development and the moral and ethical development that Kenshin Himura goes through as a character, which, like I said, I think it's just a step, just one step above what Togashi Yoshihiro does in Yu Yu Hakusho. So in the Kyoto arc, the main thing that sort of sets off this path, or the psychological evolution that Kenshin Himura has to go through as a character, is the fight between him and Seta Sojiro. So if like Kenshin Sakabato is really important in this fight, and this is the point where you really start to understand how important the Sakabato is to Kenshin Himura. The Sakabato, the sort of reverse blade sword, if you don't know, that Kenshin uses, it symbolizes, it represents his consciousness. And if you realize, like, when Kenshin Himura is just Kenshin Himura, he uses the dull edge to fight. But when he transforms into Batosai the Manslayer, he sort of flips that blade around, and so the blade actually is a symbol of the dual aspects of his psychology. And when he engages in that fight with Seta Sojiro, he breaks his sword, which is a symbol of how his consciousness has to be broken down and then be rebuilt without Batosai the manslayer. And so this fight, you know, the breaking of the Sakabato also symbolizes how Kenshin, you know, fluctuates between you know, Kenshin Himura and Batosai the manslayer. And so he, you know, of course, he has to find another sword. And in the process of finding another sword, he runs up against another member of the Jupangatana, which is, you know, the sort of main henchman of Makoto Shishio, who's the main villain of the Kyoto arc. He comes up against, you know, Sword Hunter Cho. And this is a very interesting scene here, because if you remember, Kenshin actually he actually makes the decision to kill Sword Hunter Cho in order to save, you know, the baby. But he makes this decision. But even though he makes this decision, he doesn't transform into Batosai the manslayer when he makes this decision, and this has very important implications for, you know, Kenshin Himura's, you know, character development and his sort of psychological development, and also his ethical development. The reason why he makes the decision to kill Cho is not because he's been consumed by the violence of, you know, Batosai the manslayer, but because he makes an ethical decision. And this introduces some very important ethical complexity into Kenshin Himura's character, because Watsuki Nobuhiro uses this sort of incident to show the ethical limitations of Kenshin's position. Because remember, Kenshin, you know, is, you know, a pacifist. He believes that, you know, you have to engage in a fight, but he doesn't believe that, you know, you should kill people. And he believes that you should, use the least amount of force necessary to sort of contain your opponent. But because he believes that, Nobuhiro puts him into, you know, a sort of ethical dilemma by having him, be placed in a situation where the only way he can get out of it is to, basically kill Sword Hunter Cho. And so that shows the ethical limitations of Kenshin's, ethical position. And it sort of, provides a very important, snapshot of the ethical complexity that's produced when, in Kenshin Himura's character, when he's placed in this sort of situation with Sword Hunter Cho. And part of Nobuhiro's genius is this. We hear a lot about the importance of creating obstacles for your main character or your protagonist. And this usually gets expressed when we say, the antagonist has to be a person who, the protagonist can't beat. They have to be stronger than the protagonist to produce some obstacle. But here Nobuhiro gives Kenshin an obstacle, but it's not a obstacle in terms of fight. In terms of, fighting ability between Sword Hunter Cho and Kenshin Himura, it's an ethical obstacle. It's an obstacle that shows the sort of ethical limitations of Kenshin's position and the sort of power that he needs to attain if he wants this to be a viable ethical position. So then Kenshin has to learn the succession technique from Hiko Seijiro. And again, Watsuki Nobuhiro is a genius because, again, he sort of reverses a shonen cliche. The shonen cliche is that, part of the power up process is that, you may have to gain a technique that, might kill you. And, it takes away your life force, or it takes away from your lifespan, or, something cliche like that. But when Kenshin Himura learns the succession technique from Hiko Seijiro, he has to learn one very important lesson, which is this: the power to protect your friends doesn't come from your willingness or your ability to sacrifice your life. It comes from your desire to live for them. And this is the most important aspect of the succession technique that Kenshin learns. And this is what Hiko Seijiro teaches Kenshin Himura. He says that if you have a strong enough will to live, then you can access the power that you need in order to protect your friends without having to revert to being consumed by the violence of Batosai the manslayer. And so the succession technique, the Amakakaru Ryu no Hirameki, symbolizes Kenshin's will to live, and it symbolizes his psychological and ethical transition away from Batosai the manslayer, which is the ideology or the belief that in order to protect your friends, you may have to sacrifice your own life to do it. And he transitions into a new ideology or a new worldview, which is that that the power to protect your friends comes from your willingness to live for them, not from your willingness to die for them. And that's a very important component of the Rurouni Kenshin manga, because it's a complete reversal of the shonen cliche that the power up comes from sacrificing your own life force or your own lifespan to gain the power you need in order to protect your friends. So now I want to talk about, Kenshin's path to, atonement, how he comes to, atone for his crimes as a manslayer, as a hitokiri. So the central question that drives Kenshin's character is, can he atone for his crimes as, a hitokiri? And if he can atone for those crimes, how does he do it? And if he can't atone for those crimes, then where does he go from there? The one of the important aspects of how he atones for his crimes as a hitokiri is by taking moral responsibility for the things that he's done as Batosai the manslayer, and he can take moral responsibility for those things by not allowing himself to revert back into Batosai the manslayer. And so his unwillingness to revert back into Batosai is a symbol or represents how precisely how it is that he, takes more responsibility for his actions. And this is also symbolized in, how he defeats Makoto Shishio. Because remember, Hiko Seijiro is stronger than Kenshin Himura. I mean, it's entirely possible that Hiko Seijiro could beat Makoto Shishio for Kenshin. But Hiko Seijiro tells him, like, this is your problem. And part of taking, more responsibility is, defeating Makoto Shishio, because the people that you worked with are the ones who created Makoto Shishio. And the central problem, and this is, sort of the genius of Watsuki Nobuhiro, the central problem of, the manga is that Kenshin Himura can't atone for his crimes as a hitokiri. And this is very unusual for a mangaka to give a protagonist a goal that it is impossible for them to reach. And here's why I say Kenshin can't, atone for his crimes. To atone for something means that you make amends. And to be able to make amends for something assumes that you have the ability to calculate what you owe, right? If you want to make amends with somebody, then you have to be able to know what you owe them, and so that you can, properly make amends. But as an assassin, Kenshin Himura, obviously he killed people, and a human life is invaluable. There's no way to evaluate, to determine how valuable a human life is, because a human life is absolutely invaluable. It's sort of outside of what it's possible to calculate. And so Kenshin can't offer anything that's as valuable as a human life. He certainly can't bring these people, back to life. And so the problem that Kenshin faces when he tries to, figure out how to atone for his crimes as Batosai the manslayer is that he basically, can't do it. And I think this is the most important part of Kenshin Himura's, psychological and ethical, evolution as a protagonist and main character. Because if you remember, and I believe it's in chapter 227. Yes, I'm a nerd that way. I memorized the chapter number. I believe it was in chapter 227 where Kenshin finally is able to give Yukishiro Inishi the answer for how he atones as Batosai the manslayer. And again, it's a completely unsatisfactory, answer from the standpoint of, justice and ethics. But he tells Yukishiro Inishi, I can atone for my crimes as a Hitokiri, as Batosai the manslayer, by using the sword in my heart to fulfill my struggling life. And I know this may sound, very cliche, it may not sound that important, but it's very important for two reasons. The first reason is that he can't atone for his crimes as Batosai the manslayer, but he can take moral responsibility for what he's done. And the way that he takes moral responsibility for what he's done is by continuing to struggle for his own existence as a just and as an ethical human being. And so the conclusion that Kenshin Himura comes to is that to be a human is to struggle with these fundamentally unanswerable questions of ethics and questions of justice. And the second thing that's very important for Kenshin Himura's psychological and ethical, development throughout the manga is that he realizes this. Atonement is not a goal that you reach. It's not clear cut. It's not as if, at one point you don't have atonement, but, at another point you have atonement. Excuse me. Atonement is not something that you possess or that you have. It's not a goal that you reach. Atonement is a process that you engage in to constantly reaffirm your own humanity by constantly engaging in a process of taking moral responsibility for what you have done. In Kenshin Himura's case, by not allowing himself to revert back into Batosai the manslayer. And so for me, this is, easy 3 points for Nobuhiro Watsuki, because of the way he chronicles the spiritual, psychological, and ethical development of Kenshin Himura by reversing the sort of shonen cliches that you don't see. And this is true even now. You don't see any real reversals of the shonen cliches in practically any of the manga that's out now, except for Hunter x Hunter, which, like I said before, is the best ongoing shonen manga. So even though Yusuke has some of the best character development ever in the shonen genre, like I said, Togashi, I always give high praise to Togashi Yoshihiro because, like I said, he's just an absolute genius when it comes to characterization. But I think that Kenshin's psychological and ethical development is a step above Yusuke Urameshi's ethical and psychological development for this one reason. And it's only because of this reason. It's only because Kenshin Himura's psychological and ethical development parallels very closely with a philosophical argument about the nature of humanity and about what it means to be an ethical and a just human being. And, that's basically the only reason, because that philosophical argument serves as the foundation for Kenshin's psychology, and it serves as the foundation for his psychological and ethical development. And this is a very strong philosophical argument, a very strong philosophical undertone that I think that Yusuke Urameshi just doesn't do as well. I think it's there, but I don't think it's as strong as, the sort of philosophical argument that Watsuki uses as the foundation of Kenshin Himura's psychological and ethical development. To me, it's just a slight step above, a slight step above. So now that's another 3 points for Watsuki Nobuhiro. So it's now 6 points to 2 points for Team Kenshin versus Team Hakusho. Like I said, it's getting really bad for you guys. Team Hakusho is getting really bad for you guys. So now let's go to the fourth and final category, which is worth 2 points, which is secondary characters. So obviously by secondary characters, I mean not main characters. But let me be a little bit more specific. I consider Yusuke, Kuwabara, Hiei, Karama, Keiko, Botan, Koenma, and Genkai. Like, I consider them to be, main characters. So any character that's, not any of those. And similarly, I would consider, Kenshin, Kaoru, Sonosuke, and Yahiko to be the main, sort of characters. To not be, they're, to me, they're not secondary or side characters, because they are the main characters. Although they're not the primary main character. I'll put it that way. They're main characters, but not the primary main character. So in this category, I want to focus on two things. Do the secondary characters get development? And if they do, how much development do they get? But the more important question, I think, is how were the secondary characters used to add depth to the story, add depth to the concepts, and add, depth to the themes that the mangaka is working with. And so, of course, it includes, the secondary characters' relationship to the concepts, themes, and deeper meanings of the story, but also their importance to the progression of the narrative itself. So there's two things for YuYu Hakusho that I think Togashi does, exceptionally well. The first is that Yu Yu Hakusho is one of the few mangas that actually have a larger cast of characters, but with very few exceptions, all of those characters get some form. They just absolutely get some form of character development. Um, and I think that's very rare, and it's also a testament to just how good Togashi Yoshihiro is when it comes to characterization. The fact that all the characters in the Dark Tournament saga get some form of not all of them, but for the most part, most of them get some form of character development. And even the demons well, first of all, the sort of, Sensui's group in Chapter Black, but also all the new demons that get introduced in sort of, the saga of the Three Kings that get some form of development. It's really quite striking. And some of the more famous, secondary characters include, of course, Toguro, Sensui, Makoro, Yami, Ryzen. So, Togashi Yoshihiro has both, quantity and quality. The second thing is the sort of very, very intricate characterization that Togashi uses as a template for his characters, which is just absolutely genius. It's absolutely breathtaking. And this sort of includes the interaction between main characters and side characters. And the best example of this is the interaction that happens between Sensui, Koenma, and Yusuke Urameshi. And this is something that a lot of people I haven't seen a lot of people point out before. In the Chapter Black saga, we realized that Koenma is a morally suspect character. Here's what I mean by that. I mean that we learn that Koenma is not as moral and is not as good as we initially thought him to be. And the main reasons for this is because Koenma used Sensui as a tool. He used him as a tool. He withheld knowledge from him, even though he understood how psychologically fragile Sensui was. He still used him as a tool. He withheld knowledge from him. And then when Sensui finds out the truth, when he sees, the demons being tortured basically in those torture chambers, he realizes that, everything I did was a lie. Everything Koenma told me was a lie. And so, he loses his mind, and, that's where he gets that split personality from. So by doing this, by having this sort of, interaction between Koenma on the one hand, Sensui on the other hand, and of course between, Yusuke Urameshi on the other, because he has to now fight Sensui, there are three things that Togashi Yoshihiro is doing simultaneously. And like I said, he's just a master of characterization. It's just absolutely breathtaking. The first thing that Togashi Yoshihiro is doing with this sort of relationship between these three characters is he's producing some ethical complexity in Koenma by showing that Koenma is not as moral as we thought him to be, and sort of portraying him as a more morally suspect character. The second thing that Togashi is doing is that by having Koenma give Sensui's backstory, he uses that backstory as a way of providing internal characterization for Sensui. And in this way, we learn that Sensui is in fact a justifiable villain. And the way that Makoto Shishio was also a justifiable villain. But also the third thing that he does is he's uh he's working with these sort of external characterization of the relationship between Sensui and Yusuke and Koenma. And here's what I mean by that. What I mean is that there's an ethical dilemma that Yusuke now faces. He has to sort of interpret and reinterpret his relationship to both Sensui, because now he knows that Sensui is a justifiable villain, and he has to reinterpret his relationship to Koenma because he learns that Koenma is now a morally suspect character. So Yusuke is put in the sort of catch-22, in the sort of catch-22. He, on the one hand, he knows that Sensui is wrong. He knows that if Sensui succeeds in opening up this portal to the demon world, it could be disastrous for the human world. But on the other hand, he knows that by fighting Sensui, he affirms the unjust authority of spirit world, which is represented by Koenma and Koenma's father. Also, another aspect of Togashi Yoshihiro's, intricate characterization, is that, and I've said this before, is that even though the Saga of the Three King has, the third tournament, in Yu Yu Hakusho, and even though, from an action standpoint, it might not have been as creative, as, we would have liked it would have liked it to be. Excuse me for that. Mixing up my words a little bit here. I've been talking for 55 minutes. Um, Another aspect of Togashi Yoshihiro's intricate characterization is that he's working on 4 levels of characterization in the Saga of the Three Kings. The first level of characterization is on an individual level of Yusuke, Hiei, and Karama, and we sort of understand why Kuwabara is not in this last and final arc, because it deals with Demon World and Kuwabara is not a demon. And then the second level of characterization is the sort of rivalry between Yusuke, Hiei, and Karama, because remember, they're on different sides. But then, as a result of being split into these sort of factions, the third level of characterization is the relationship between Yomi and Karama, the relationship between Makoro and Hiei, and the relationship between Ryzen and Yusuke. And then the fourth level of characterization is Yomi and Karama versus Makoro and Hiei versus Ryzen and Yusuke. So again, very, very intricate characterization going on here. So I know a lot of you are probably asking yourself, well, how can Watsuki Nobuhiro outdo that? That sounds, very good for Togashi Yoshihiro. Not so fast. Some of the more famous characters of Rurouni Kenshin include Hajime Saito, Makoto Shishio, Aoshi Shinomori, Hiko Seijiro, Seta Sojiro, Yukishiro Inishi, and Tomoe. And here's the intricate characterization of Watsuki Nobuhiro. His side characters function in 3 ways. They function in a triple capacity. At the level of characterization, each new villain or obstacle functions as a device for Kenshin's ethical and psychological development, from the standpoint of, the internal characterization of Kenshin Himura. When Aoshi Shinomori gets, when it comes to Aoshi Shinomori, Kenshin's, sort of split personality between, Kenshin Himuro on the one hand, and sort of, Batosai the manslayer is more fully explored. Then when we get to Seta Sojiro, the symbolization that occurs with, the broken Sakabato, when we get to Hiko Seijiro, who's, not a villain or an obstacle, but he does teach him the succession technique, and so we get, this very developed theme of the relationship between life and death. Then Makoto Shishio, when, Kenshin defeats Makoto Shishio, he sort of, gains, moral, the moral responsibility that's necessary for him to engage in this process of trying to, of morally, of atonement. And then Yukishiro Inishi. Because, Yukishiro Inishi wants him to atone with his life. And, he believes that, atonement is about, Jinshu. And for those of you who don't know Japanese, they have two different concepts of justice. One is Tenchu, which is heavenly justice, which is the justice that comes from, the gods. And the second is Jinshu, which says that even if the gods don't punish you, I, as a human, will punish you, basically, in place of the gods. Jin, it's Jinshu. Jin comes from the kanji, which means human, so human justice. Then at the second level, the second way in which, Watsuki Nobuhiro's characters function is at the level of theme. And this comes out very explicitly in the theme about the relationship between violence and psychological instability. And, Aoshi, Shishio, Yukishiro Inishi, Hiko Seijiro, Seta Sojiro, Tomoe. They all are implicated in this theme about the relationship between violence and psychological instability. Aoshi's, obsession with being number one leads him to a very dark place. And the more violent he becomes, the more psychologically unstable he becomes. This is also true with, Shishio, with his extreme nationalism and imperialism. He sort of takes the violence of the Bakumatsu and the violence of the Ishin Shishi, where they, basically tried to burn him to death, and he uses that as a way to fuel his, his violence. And even at when we see Makoto Shishio get defeated, like he's literally consumed by flames, and yet he's laughing. He's really crazy. He's lost his marbles at that point. And then we also see this with, Yukishiro Inishi's obsession with Jinshu, and the sort of, violence that he goes through, and the sort of psychological instability that's produced by this commitment to violence. In the third level at which Watsuki Nobuhiro's, side characters function is at the level of concept. And again, this philosophical argument that, Watsuki Nobuhiro has been laying out is very, very important. So, at the level of concept, each side character functions as, like a conceptual piece of a puzzle. Because remember, there's a very specific argument that's laid out, a very specific philosophical argument about the nature of justice, the nature of ethics, and the relationship that has to the nature of, of one's humanity. And sort of, it lays the groundwork for this, philosophical argument, for what it means to become a just and ethical human being. So I give this, 3 points for Watsuki Nobuhiro. And here I think it's a little bit debatable, but I think Watsuki Nobuhiro comes out a little bit on top. And here's why. Again, Togashi Yoshihiro, absolutely transformed the shonen genre. And I've mentioned this a couple of times before. Like he takes the shonen from just being, perhaps an action story, which, was a trend started by Akira Toriyama, and then he adds characterization to that. And not only does he add characterization, but he adds various levels of characterization, which is, like I said before, just genius of him. But Watsuki Nobuhiro raises characterization to a new level, because he includes Togashi Yoshihiro's achievements within his own work. Like, remember, like I said, in the Saga of the Three Kings, there's 4 levels of characterization. But that's only in the Saga of the Three Kings. Watsuki Nobuhiro takes this idea of various levels of characterization and uses it to apply it to the entire story of Rurouni Kenshin. Like, whereas Togashi Yoshihiro only does that and he does it a little bit at the beginning of the Spirit Detective saga, but he only really does it at, the Saga of the Three Kings. And Watsuki Nobuhiro sort of takes that as the premise for his entire story. I mean, uh, like he just just edges out Togashi Yoshihiro because his characterization is one step above for the entirety of the manga rather than for just one specific arc or saga of the manga. And also because he ties characterization to themes, and he also ties not only characterization to themes, but he then takes the extra step of tying characterization to a philosophical framework and a philosophical argument that encompasses politics, justice, ethics, moral responsibility, atonement, violence, psychological instability. So for those reasons, I think Watsuki Nobuhiro comes out a little bit on top of Togashi Yoshihiro. So as it stands now, Team Kenshin has, Watsuki has 8 points. Rurouni Kenshin has 8 points, and Togashi Yoshihiro has only 2 points. So I think, 8-2, obviously, Rurouni Kenshin takes it. But let me just say this again, like the fact that this, seems so lopsided, Rurouni Kenshin has 8 points on one hand, and, YuYu Hakusho has only 2 points on the other hand, doesn't really reflect just how good of a mangaka, Togashi Yoshihiro is. Like I said before, he absolutely revolutionized the shonen genre. And, even though he comes before, he gets, some points for coming before Watsuki Nobuhiro and, sort of providing the foundation upon which Watsuki Nobuhiro would later build his own manga, Rurouni Kenshin. I think that Watsuki Nobuhiro takes, moves it up just a couple of levels that, Yu Yu Hakusho just doesn't have, or doesn't do it consistently throughout the entire manga. So for those reasons, I think, Rurouni Kenshin is, better than Yu Yu Hakusho. And so, hey man, I told you I would do it. I told you I would do it, man. I told you. I mean, how could you argue this? I'm not saying Togashi Yoshihiro is a, bad mangaka. He's excellent. He's a great. He's a genius. But Jesus, you try to compare Yu Yu Hakusho to Rurouni Kenshin? I hope that anybody who's on Team Hakusho has realized the error of their ways. And you know what? I'm just gonna be the bigger and better man and say, I forgive you. I forgive you. It's easy for you to see how you could have been mistaken about this. But as long as you're willing to admit your mistakes, I will forgive you. I will forgive you. So yeah, man, this was a very, interesting exercise for me. I really loved, going through this, exercise of thinking, why is it that I believe that Rurouni Kenshin is better than Yu Yu Hakusho? And it was a very fun experience. Can't wait for the next versus match. Remember, subscribe to the Cloud Village. Continue to support the movement. Continue to support these versus matchups. So yeah. This was your boy Ubi Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.